They came from the cold, dark stretches of the void, an armada of steel and hunger forged in centuries of conquest. To them, war was not only survival, it was sacred ritual, the only language worth speaking. Their ships cut through the silent heavens with fire trailing behind them, vast hulks filled with soldiers bred for obedience and destruction. In their chronicles, every new species encountered had either bent the knee or burned. None had resisted long enough to be remembered as more than a line of conquest. They expected humanity to be no different. The alien generals had studied Earth before their arrival. They pored over intercepted broadcasts, fragmented histories, echoes of ancient conflicts. What they saw astonished and thrilled them. No species, not in all their long campaigns, had warred as humans had warred. From sticks and stones to machines of fire, from bronze to nuclear flame, humans had fought each other with a ferocity that made even seasoned invaders pause. Entire nations had risen and fallen in blood. Entire continents scarred by conquest, rebellion, and vengeance. The aliens admired it in their way. Humanity's appetite for conflict, they believed, made them a worthy opponent, a prize to claim with pride. The generals whispered among themselves that Earth would be the most glorious battle in living memory, a war that would test their legions and prove their gods of war were still with them. In their arrogance, they did not prepare for the possibility of any other outcome. When their fleet entered the solar system, they sent their message not with subtlety, but with thunder. A transmission blared across human channels, blunt and unyielding. Submit or prepare for annihilation. The ritual of conquest begins. Resist us with honor or kneel in shame. They waited for humanity's armies to rise. They expected to see the skies filled with ships scrambling to match their power, weapons turned outward, speeches of defiance echoing across the planet. They had seen it 100 times before. Every race, no matter how feeble, fought back in desperation. Resistance was fuel for the ritual, but what they received was silence. Days passed and no planetary defenses were launched. No nuclear salvos cut the heavens. Earth remained frustratingly still. The generals whispered among themselves, suspecting cowardice. Perhaps humanity had already surrendered in their hearts. Perhaps the war would end before it began. Disappointment gnawed at them. They had come for a glorious struggle, not a hollow conquest. And then, at last, the humans answered. Not with fleets, not with soldiers, not with missiles or war machines. The humans sent a delegation. Small crafts moved carefully into the alien perimeter, slow, unarmed, radiating no threat. The aliens bristled, their weapons trained on the fragile vessels. Surely this was a trick. Surely these were decoys, hiding some weapon that would unleash fury upon them. But the ships remained harmless, their signal repeating one message in dozens of languages. We come to talk. The delegation was received under suspicion. Alien warriors lined the chamber of first contact, towering, armored, their blades gleaming with ritual sharpness. The generals expected diplomats, perhaps leaders begging for mercy, cloaking surrender in words. Instead, what stepped forward confounded them. The humans were not warriors. They bore no weapons, no armor. Their uniforms carried no insignias of power. They introduced themselves not as generals, not as politicians, not even as scientists. They introduced themselves as social workers, mediators, healers of the human condition. The alien chamber echoed with laughter. To their ears, this was mockery, insult disguised as diplomacy. We come to war, the general thundered, and you send caretakers. Do you mock the blood oath of battle? But the humans did not flinch. They spoke with calm voices, steady and unthreatened. They said they had studied the alien transmissions. They said they understood what conquest meant, what cycles of violence did to both victor and victim. And instead of declaring war, they asked a question no enemy had ever asked before. Why do you need this war? The silence that followed was heavier than any blade. The general scoffed, trying to shake the weight from the air. War was need because war was life, he declared. Without it, their people withered. Without conquest, their society unraveled. Violence was the glue that held them together, the furnace that gave them purpose. The humans only nodded, their faces filled with something alien to the aliens themselves: compassion. One of them spoke of Earth's history, of centuries when humanity too had believed war was inevitable, when empires rose and fell on rivers of blood. They spoke of scars so deep they still shaped the human soul, scars that whispered in every border and every monument to the fallen. And then they said something more dangerous than any weapon. They said that humanity had learned. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to know that endless war was not destiny, it was trauma. And trauma could be treated. The aliens sneered. "You think us broken. You think we are children to be soothed." But the humans did not back down. They said, gently but firmly, every warrior carries wounds, even those who believe themselves whole. This, more than threats, unsettled the generals. For no enemy had ever dared to speak to them as though they were patients, as though beneath their armor they were wounded souls. It was insulting and yet unsettlingly accurate. As days stretched into weeks, the humans persisted. They refused every baited challenge to fight, every attempt to provoke violence. Instead, they asked questions. They listened to alien soldiers recount their lives, the battles that defined them, the losses they never admitted hurt. They offered silence where the aliens expected arguments, patience where they expected fury. Slowly, against their will, some of the warriors found themselves speaking more than they intended, as though the humans had carved open space in their chests where words poured out. The generals grew frustrated. They ordered their soldiers not to engage, to resist this manipulation. But whispers spread in the barracks. The humans understood them in ways even their own leaders never had. Soldiers began seeking out conversations in secret, drawn not by strategy but by something more dangerous: relief. The war had not yet begun, but already something was unraveling. The aliens had come for fire and blood. Instead, they found mirrors held up to their pain. One night, alone in his quarters, the alien general stared into the steel of his armor. He remembered the words of the human who had looked at him not with fear, but with something unbearable: empathy. Every warrior carries wounds. The words burned hotter than any blade. He could not dismiss them though he wished to, for in the silence of his heart he knew they were true. And so the first crack appeared, not in the fleet, not in the army, but in the certainty of a war that had not yet begun. The delegation of humans did not retreat after their first meetings. Where other species had sent armies and crumbled, these strange envoys remained steady. Every morning they returned, unarmed, their eyes calm, their words sharp in a way no blade could match. They did not speak of surrender or defense. They spoke of systems, of cycles, of why a civilization might cling to endless conflict as if it were oxygen. Their persistence unnerved the generals. They had prepared for bombs and fleets, not quiet analysis of their culture's sickness. The humans had not come to plead for peace. They had come to study. They observed the alien hierarchy with a precision that felt surgical. They noticed the way soldiers obeyed but never smiled, the way victories were celebrated yet left hollowness behind, the way younger warriors spoke less of triumph and more of exhaustion. It was as though they could see through armor into the fractures no one admitted existed. The aliens expected manipulation. What they received was recognition. When the social workers began to speak of post-conflict recovery, the chamber boiled with outrage. The general roared, accusing them of presumption. What did these fragile creatures know of true conquest? The humans answered with brutal honesty. They knew too much. They described their own history with detail that silenced even hardened warriors. They spoke of trenches where millions had died in mud, of skies filled with fire that erased cities in seconds, of wars so vast that they scarred generations unborn. They did not speak with pride. They spoke with weary authority, as survivors of a madness they never wished to repeat. The aliens had expected propaganda. Instead, they were handed confessions. Humanity, these envoys admitted, had been addicted to war once. Humanity had worshipped it, glorified it, used it to bind tribes and nations. But over time, humanity had learned that glory rotted, that empires crumbled from within, that conquest was an endless hunger that never fed the soul. They had begun to ask different questions, not how to fight better, but how to stop fighting at all. For the first time, the alien soldiers heard war spoken of not as destiny, but as disease. The general tried to counter, thundering that without conflict, their people would stagnate, would lose purpose. The humans replied softly, "Purpose can be built in many ways. Conflict is the weakest of them. Healing," they said, "was harder. Cooperation was harder, but harder did not mean weaker. Harder meant stronger." The soldiers listening felt the words like blows, not because they wounded, but because they rang true. In private, they began to murmur. They asked themselves questions they had never dared to think. Why did the victories leave them emptier? Why did triumph taste like ash? Why did the scars they bore never fade, no matter how many enemies they crushed? The humans exploited none of this with malice. They simply listened. They set up quiet sessions where alien soldiers could speak freely, where rage could pour out without judgment. They introduced simple practices alien culture had never known: sharing circles, open dialogue, spaces where pain could be named instead of buried. Soldiers walked in sneering, yet walked out lighter, confused by the strange relief that came from being heard. The generals tried to forbid such gatherings. They called them poison, sabotage, weakness disguised as care. But their own soldiers disobeyed, sneaking away to meet the humans, desperate for the rare taste of peace. The virus of empathy spread faster than any battle doctrine. Still, resistance remained strong at the top. The general plotted to provoke the humans into violence, to shatter their illusion of control. He ordered intimidation rituals, warriors towering over the envoys, weapons inches from their throats, threats hissed in the darkness of council chambers. The humans did not flinch. One even placed a hand gently on the blade and said, "You are more afraid than I am." The words struck like thunder. The warrior withdrew shaken, because in that moment he realized it was true. The aliens had no defense against such disarming honesty. Over weeks, victories piled up, though no shot was fired. A soldier who had once gloried in slaughter now confessed to dreams that haunted him. Another admitted she no longer wanted to raise her child into the life of conquest. Small fractures spread across the army's resolve. The humans did not gloat. They offered only quiet acknowledgement and more listening. It was war fought in whispers and silence, but its effect was greater than any bombardment. The general called a council of war. He shouted of treachery, demanded unity, threatened punishment. Yet he could see it in their eyes. His soldiers were no longer his. They obeyed his orders in body, but their minds were elsewhere, wrapped around the impossible idea that another path existed. For the first time in centuries, they questioned the ritual of war itself. The humans pressed further. They introduced stories from Earth, villages once locked in blood feuds that now shared harvests, nations that had hated each other yet built alliances. They did not claim perfection. They admitted humanity still struggled, still stumbled, still sometimes fell back into violence. But they framed those struggles as proof that change was possible even when it seemed impossible. The aliens listened, transfixed. To them, peace had never been an option. Now it shimmered before them, fragile yet dazzling. The general grew desperate. He declared the humans deceivers, masters of manipulation. But a younger officer stood and asked, "If it is a trick, why does it heal?" The chamber fell into uneasy silence. For no one could deny that speaking with the humans left wounds less raw, burdens less heavy. Even those who hated the envoys most felt the subtle shift. Their bloodlust no longer burned as it once had. The humans pressed their advantage without force. They began organizing food distributions among the alien ranks, showing that cooperation solved problems faster than conquest. They set up mediation between rival warrior houses, diffusing feuds that had simmered for decades. They even brought in education specialists, teaching alien children concepts of trust and dialogue. Every step struck at the roots of conquest. Every act of care was a blade against war's heart. The general realized too late that the war was already being fought and lost, not on the battlefield but in the minds of his soldiers. They were being disarmed not of weapons, but of their need to use them. And that was more dangerous than any fleet humanity could have mustered. The slow erosion of certainty was more devastating than any bombardment. The general had prepared for fire, for blood, for the clash of armies. He had not prepared for silence in the barracks, for soldiers who no longer sang the chants of war with conviction, for warriors who looked at their weapons and wondered whether they were holding tools or chains. The humans had brought no fleets, but they had done what fleets never could. They had made his people doubt. At first, he clung to fury. He told himself this was temporary, that the hunger for battle would return. He punished those who lingered too long with the envoys, threatened exile, invoked ancient oaths. But punishment only hardened the cracks. The more he raged, the more his warriors looked at him with eyes that asked questions he could not answer. Why fight if fighting only fed the wound? Why conquer if conquest never ended? The humans pressed forward with relentless patience. They sent more specialists, not soldiers but healers of other kinds. Educators who taught alien youth how to build rather than destroy. Mediators who helped long-feuding clans discover common ground. Community builders who encouraged shared projects instead of raids. Each initiative spread like water through stone, finding the smallest crevices and widening them. The army that had once been bound by ritual of conquest began to find strength in something else, connection. The general called it corruption. Yet in his darkest hours, alone with the silence of his chambers, he felt the weight of his own armor crushing him. He remembered battles that had left him drenched in blood, victories that had left his chest hollow, triumphs that never silenced the ghosts of the fallen. He told himself he fought for glory, for tradition, for the gods of war. But in the stillness, he wondered if he fought only because he did not know what else to be. The humans had forced that question upon him, and it cut deeper than any blade. The confrontation could not be delayed forever. The general demanded an audience with the lead human envoy. His voice shook with anger as he demanded answers. Why had they not fought back? Why did they persist with their poison of peace? What did they hope to achieve by dismantling his army from within? The human did not raise his voice. He spoke with the same steady tone he had carried since the first day. He said humanity had known the addiction of war, had drowned in it, had nearly destroyed itself through it. He said humanity had learned, not because it was noble but because it had no choice. And he said something the general could not ignore. We are not weak because we do not fight you. We are strong because we survived fighting ourselves. The words struck like thunder. Every warrior carries wounds, the human had once said. Now the general understood. Humanity's strength was not in the sharpness of its weapons, but in the scars it carried. Scars from wars so vast they had threatened extinction. Scars from mistakes repeated until lessons finally burned themselves into the species' bones. These envoys were not naive pacifists. They were veterans of a war with their own nature, and they had won, at least enough to stand here now. The general trembled because he saw for the first time that his people had never truly won a war. They had only repeated the same wound, century after century, mistaking survival for victory. The humans revealed the truth. They were trapped in trauma, not tradition. And trauma could be ended. The alien council split apart under the weight of revelation. Some leaders clung to the old ways, demanding violence, calling the humans deceivers who sought to rob them of honor. But others began to side with the envoys, admitting that their soldiers were already changed, that the hunger for endless conquest was dying. The fleet, once a unified weapon, became a collection of uncertain voices. The general saw discipline unravel not through rebellion, but through hope. The humans did not gloat. They continued their quiet campaign, building structures of dialogue where once there had only been command. They encouraged councils among soldiers, places where disagreements could be aired without blood. They taught negotiation, taught compromise, taught the alien tongue how to form words for peace it had never needed before. Slowly, impossibly, the culture of conquest bent, not broken by war but reshaped by care. In time, the soldiers themselves began to refuse certain orders. Small at first, delays, hesitations, but then openly declaring that they would not burn another world for ritual. The general's power slipped away, not because he was defeated in battle, but because his army no longer believed in the battle itself. For a warlord, there was no greater defeat. He sought one last confrontation, not with weapons, but with words. He demanded the human envoy explain the true weapon they carried, the secret that allowed them to undo an empire without firing a single shot. The envoy answered simply, "We have learned to wage peace as others wage war, with discipline, with patience, with unyielding resolve." The general understood then that he had never faced an enemy like this. Other species fought with fire that could be met with fire, but these humans fought with something that could not be extinguished, because it grew stronger the more it was resisted. He bowed his head, not in submission, but in exhaustion. For the first time in his life, he admitted what he had always feared, that he did not want another war. The transformation spread across his people like dawn breaking after endless night. Councils replaced battlefields. Rival clans that had once gloried in slaughter now sat across from each other in dialogue, guided by human mediators. The fleet remained, but its purpose shifted, from conquest to protection, from ritual to responsibility. It was not easy, and it was not without resistance, but the cycle had been broken. And once broken, it could not be reforged. The humans left no monuments, no thrones, no banners of victory. They left something greater: tools, practices, frameworks for healing. The aliens, once a people bound only by the hunger for war, now carried the seed of another destiny. It would not erase their past, but it would redefine their future. The general, in his final years, wrote words that shocked generations. He admitted his defeats, confessed his fears, and acknowledged the humans not as enemies but as teachers. His writings became scripture of a different kind, quoted not in war councils but in schools and assemblies dedicated to cooperation. He wrote, "We sought warriors, we found healers, and they defeated us with mercy sharper than any blade." The galaxy remembered the event as the war that never was. To outsiders, it seemed as though humanity had avoided annihilation through sheer luck, through some incomprehensible tactic. But to those who had been there, it was clear. Humanity had fought the most dangerous battle imaginable, and won. They had turned their own greatest weakness, their long addiction to war, into a weapon of survival. They had shown that compassion could be wielded with the same discipline as violence. And so the story spread. Humans, the only species who waged peace like war. The years after the fleet's surrender were not quiet. A civilization built on conquest does not shed its skin overnight. Old leaders clung to tradition, old warriors longed for battle songs, and entire worlds still revolved around the rituals of war. Yet the seed had been planted, and seeds once rooted will grow. What the humans left behind was not control but possibility, and possibility spread like fire through dry fields. At first, the galaxy scoffed. Other species had watched the invaders descend upon Earth and prepared themselves to mourn yet another world. When word spread that no battle had taken place, that the feared conquerors had left Earth without a shot fired, disbelief reigned. Rumors multiplied. Some whispered that humans had secretly built weapons more terrible than any known. Others claimed the aliens had fallen victim to plague. Still others said the warlords had gone mad. Few believed the truth, for it was too strange to fit their understanding. That a species could resist conquest with words, with patience, with something as fragile as care, it seemed impossible. But impossibility does not stop truth. Envoys from other worlds traveled to the former conquerors' domains, expecting fortresses, drill yards, legions sharpening for the next campaign. Instead, they found councils in session, soldiers teaching their children to read rather than march, warriors laying down blades to build homes. And always in the shadows of these transformations, human advisors stood, not commanding, not ruling, but guiding. The former conquerors began to call themselves by a new name, one that abandoned the word for war in their tongue and replaced it with a word that meant renewal. Their history books shifted, no longer endless lines of campaigns but reflections on what those campaigns had cost. Schools taught not only strategy but empathy. Temples once dedicated to gods of blood slowly re-sanctified themselves to gods of healing. The transformation was not perfect, nor was it painless, yet it was real. The humans who had started it all never claimed victory. They never stood on podiums or declared dominion. Instead, they explained to anyone who would listen that this was simply what humanity did best: take pain, study it, and turn it into something survivable. Other species began to see the pattern. Humanity's history of chaos and violence was not shame but training. Where others saw fragility, humans carried resilience. Where others saw scars, humans carried lessons. The galactic councils began to take notice. Once, humanity had been a backwater world, technologically competent but unremarkable compared to ancient civilizations spread across the stars. But now, species whispered of them with a mix of fear and awe. They were not feared for their fleets or their weapons. They were feared because they had defeated war itself, and any species that could do that might shape the galaxy in ways more profound than any empire ever had. Delegations came, not with threats but with requests. Species long fractured by internal strife sought human mediators to settle disputes. Worlds torn by civil wars invited human social workers to guide reconciliation. Even ancient powers who had once dismissed Earth as primitive began to quietly ask for advisors. Humanity, once ignored, became indispensable. And still, they never raised a fleet. The old conquerors watched all this with mixed emotions. Some resented the transformation, longing for the simplicity of conquest. But most found relief in the new order. Soldiers who had once known nothing but slaughter now built families. Generals who had spent lifetimes in campaigns now became leaders of reconstruction. For the first time, their people tasted continuity without destruction.